My father kicked me out of the family business because I fixed a single mom's car for free. There was something about the smell of motor oil that felt like home to me. It had been that way since I was a kid, watching my grandpa's callous hands bring dead engines back to life. At 31, I was elbow deep in grease under the hood of a '67 Mustang, trying to coax its carburetor back from the grave while classic George Strait crackled through our ancient radio. That was Hank's Auto Shop, the place that had shaped every part of who I am. Gramps founded this garage back in '85, pouring his heart and soul into the place when the oil bus was hitting our little Texas town hard. He handed it over to my dad Hank and Uncle Roy when his health started failing about a decade later. I practically grew up on this concrete floor, surrounded by the symphony of pneumatic wrenches and the percussion of hammers on metal. The walls were lined with sun-faded posters of Corvettes and Camaros that had been there so long they were practically part of the structure. This morning started like any other. Coffee from the dented pot that's probably older than me, the smell of WD-40 and burnt oil, and Dad already barking orders before I could get my work boots laced up. "Tom, that Mustang needs to be done by noon. Reynolds is coming by with cash, and we need it." I nodded without looking up. Dad had always been about the bottom line. It was all numbers to him. Labor hours, parts markup, profit margins. He ran this place like a general, and sometimes I wonder if he remembered why we were there in the first place. My grandpa, who I just called Gramps, was different. He taught me that being a mechanic was about more than fixing engines. "You ain't just fixing cars, Tommy," he used to tell me while we worked side by side. "You're fixing people's lives." That car might be taking someone to their wedding, or their mama's funeral, or their kid's baseball game. You remember that. Gramps was the real heart of this place before his hands got too shaky to hold a wrench. He'd sometimes fix Mrs. Wilson's station wagon for the cost of parts because he knew her husband had passed and she was raising 3 kids on a teacher's salary. Or he'd stay late helping young couples get their first clunker running right because everybody deserves a chance to get somewhere, Tommy. Dad hated it. Every free oil change or discounted timing belt was like a personal insult to him. "This is a business, not a charity," he'd growl, usually just after Gramps had waived off payment from someone down on their luck. I still remember my 10th birthday, like it was yesterday. While other kids got video games or bikes, Gramps gave me my first real socket wrench set. It was nothing fancy, just a basic Craftsman kit in a metal case. But the way he presented it to me, you'd think he was passing down Excalibur. "A real man builds things that last, Tommy," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Machines trust love. They all need the right tools and regular maintenance. Remember that." I had kept that wrench set polished and organized for 21 years. It sat in my toolbox like a family heirloom. Some of my best memories are from those long summer afternoons in the early 90s, when Gramps would let me help with simple jobs while he told stories about muscle cars from his youth, races down Main Street that the sheriff pretended not to see, and the specific rumble of a perfectly tuned big block V8 that sounds like America itself, boy. Saturday family barbecues were the highlight of my childhood. After the garage closed, our whole extended family would gather in Dad's backyard, Uncle Roy manning the grill, cousins playing tag between cars in the driveway, and Gramps holding court with his wild stories that grew more impressive with each telling. Later, we'd pile into the living room and watch VHS tapes of Smokey and the Bandit or American Graffiti for the 100th time. I'd fall asleep to the adults laughing and the familiar dialogue I could recite by heart. Those memories felt like they were from another lifetime now. Things started changing after Gramps had his first stroke. The barbecues got less frequent. The garage got more serious, and Dad's focus narrowed exclusively to keeping the business profitable. The thing about small-town Texas was that reputations mattered. Gramps built ours by being the guy who'd help anyone. He fixed the volunteer fire department's equipment for free. He'd stop on the highway for stranded motorists. He remembered everyone's kids' names and asked about them. When people around here think of Hank's Auto Shop, they still think of Gramps, not Dad, and that drives Dad crazy. I've tried to keep some of Gramps' spirit alive in how I treat our customers. The small kindnesses, throwing in a free oil filter, staying late to finish a job, so someone can get to work the next day, explaining repairs in plain English instead of mechanical jargon designed to confuse and upsell. But Dad watched me like a hawk. He could smell a discount from across the garage. "You think we can pay the electric bill with goodwill?" He asked me last week after I knocked a few bucks off Mrs. Peterson's bill. She was 78 and living on Social Security. "Your grandfather nearly ran this place into the ground with his bleeding heart. I won't let you do the same." I wanted to argue that Gramps' approach brought us loyal customers who've been coming back for decades, but I bit my tongue. No point poking the bear. The truth is, the shop has been struggling lately. A big chain auto center opened up near the highway exit last year, offering flashy waiting rooms with free Wi-Fi and coffee bars. They can order parts cheaper than we can and undercut our labor rates. Dad's been on edge ever since, checking the books twice daily and cutting costs wherever possible. "We need every dollar, Tom," he muttered yesterday while reviewing invoices. "Every single dollar counts right now." I got it. I did. But something in me rebelled against the coldness of it all. It felt like a betrayal of everything Gramps stood for. The Mustang I'm working on belongs to Mr. Reynolds, a regular who's been bringing his cars here since before I was born. It's his pride and joy, a Highland Green fastback that he's owned for 30 years. He's restoring it piece by piece on a factory worker salary, saving up for months between each upgrade. I could charge him full price for this carburetor rebuild, but I know he's hoping to have the car ready for his daughter's wedding next month. So I quietly ordered the parts at cost and didn't add our usual markup. Dad hasn't noticed yet, and with luck, he won't check the parts invoice against the customer bill. These small acts of rebellion kept me sane, like I was preserving some essential truth that Dad had forgotten. Uncle Roy is a bit more flexible than Dad, though he'd never admit it in front of him. Sometimes when Dad's not around, he'll slip me a wink when I round down an estimate or throw in a free rotation with a tire change. "You're just like him, you know," Roy told me once when we were closing up shop alone. "Your grandpa, got the same hands." Same way with people, too. It was the highest compliment I could imagine. The Mustang was coming along nicely. I had the rebuilt carburetor mounted and was adjusting the float levels when I heard the distinctive rumble of a truck with exhaust issues pulling into our lot. The engine sounded rough, misfiring, and possibly dealing with a vacuum leak from what my ears could tell. Dad stepped out of the office, wiping his hands on a shop rag even though they were already clean. He always did this when greeting new customers, a mechanic's habit, I guess. I kept working, but watched in the corner of my eye as a beat-up Ford F-150 parked near the office door. It was at least 15 years old, with faded blue paint and a dent in the passenger door. The kind of truck that had been worked hard and had the battle scars to prove it. The driver stepped out, a young woman maybe a few years younger than me. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and her hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail. Her clothes were clean but worn, the kind of well-kept poverty that was familiar in parts of our town where factory closures hit hardest. Dad was talking to her, nodding occasionally as she gestured toward the truck's engine bay. I could see his face hardening slightly, the look he got when he sensed a customer who might struggle with payment. I finished torquing down the last bolt on the carburetor and wiped my hands, moving closer to catch their conversation. The woman's voice had an edge of desperation that sounded all too familiar in this garage. "Just started making this noise yesterday, and now it barely starts. I need it for work, and I've got my son to think about." Dad was nodding, but his arms were crossed, never a good sign. He was already calculating how much he could get from her versus how much trouble it might be to collect. I felt that familiar tension in my chest, the pull between Dad's business sense and what Gramps would do. Before I could think too hard about it, I walked over. "I can take a look right now if you want," I offered, ignoring Dad's sharp glance. The woman turned to me, relief washing over her tired face. "Could you? I'm already late for my shift, and my boss said if I miss another day..." Dad cleared his throat loudly. "Tom, you got the Mustang to finish. I'll handle this." But I was already popping the hood of the F-150, reaching for my diagnostic tools. "The Mustang's just about done. This won't take long." The truck's engine told its story to my trained ears and hands. Spark plug wires worn through, causing misfires. Simple fix, but labor-intensive. Parts would be cheap, but the book time was substantial. I could see Dad doing the mental math. A job that should cost a few $100s. The woman was watching anxiously, clutching her purse like she was afraid of what I might say. There was a child's toy on the passenger seat, and what looked like a uniform for the diner on the edge of town. Dad leaned close to me, his voice low but stern. "Don't even think about it, Tom. Nope, discounts. Not now. We can't afford your charity." I looked at the truck, at the woman, at the faded photo of Gramps on our wall. His words echoed in my head. "You ain't just fixin' cars, Tommy. You're fixin' people's lives." Dad must have seen something in my expression, because his voice dropped to a threatening whisper. "Tom, I mean it. Don't you dare give a discount." That truck wasn't just another job. It was about to change everything I knew. That old F-150 belonged to Emily Miller. She was maybe 28, with tired eyes and a stance that showed she carried the world on her shoulders. As I inspected her truck, she shared bits of her story between anxious glances at the engine. Single mom, 7-year-old son named Jake, waitressing at Dot's Diner on the edge of town. The truck wasn't just transportation. It was her lifeline to everything that kept her small family afloat. "Started making that noise 2 days ago," she explained, worry tightening her voice. "This morning it barely started. My shift tomorrow begins at 6, and my boss already gave his final warning about being late." The diagnosis wasn't good. Damaged spark plug wires, failing ignition coil, and a vacuum leak. Simple fixes mechanically, but the parts and labor would run about $400. Emily's face fell when I gave her the estimate. She clutched her worn purse tighter. The fake leather cracked at the corners. "I just don't have it right now," she admitted, eyes down. "Maybe next month after tax returns, but..." She didn't need to finish. Without the truck, she'd lose her job. Without work, there'd be no tax return. Gramps called this the poor tax, when being broke costs you more than having money. Dad stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the interaction. He checked his watch, clearly ready to wrap up for the day. I thought of what Gramps always said when helping folks in tight spots. "Helping ain't weakness, Tommy. It's strength. Takes more muscle to lift someone up than to let him stay down." Making a split-second decision, I told Emily I needed to run further diagnostics and would call her in the morning. Relief washed over her face as she left her number and arranged for a co-worker to pick her up. As closing time approached, Dad tossed me the shop keys, something he did occasionally when I needed to finish a job. "Lock up when you're done with Reynolds' Mustang," he said. "And don't forget to set the alarm." After he and Uncle Roy left, I stood alone in the silent garage, staring at Emily's truck. The decision formed fully in my mind. I drove to Pearson's Auto Parts 2 counties over, where nobody knew my connection to Hank's, and used my nearly maxed-out credit card to buy everything Emily's truck needed. Back at the shop, I worked until well past midnight. I replaced the spark plugs and wires, installed a new ignition coil, patched a vacuum leak, and threw in an oil change and air filter. The whole time, I heard Gramps, "Machines are simple, Tommy. They tell you exactly what they need if you listen. People are the same way, but most folks just don't know how to listen." When I finished, I scribbled a note. "All fixed. No charge. Call me if any issues." And tucked it with my cell number under her windshield wiper. I'd call her before work tomorrow to let her know she could pick up the truck. My plan was simple. Arrive early, move her truck to the customer lot, and tell Emily to come before Dad showed up at his usual 9 o'clock. Nobody would know I'd done anything more than a quick diagnostic. But plans rarely survive contact with reality. I arrived at 7:30 the next morning to find Dad's truck already there, something that hadn't happened in months. A major part supplier had scheduled a last-minute meeting with him about price increases. I barely had time to process this when Emily pulled into the lot in her friend's car, Jake bouncing excitedly in the back seat. She'd found my note when her friend drove her to check on the truck early that morning. I tried intercepting her outside, but she breezed past me into the shop, Jake racing ahead. "Mr. Hank." Jake called out, spotting Dad at the counter. "Did you know Tom fixed our truck? He's like a superhero or something." I froze in the doorway as Emily approached my father, gratitude beaming from her face. "Your son is an incredible person," she told him, unaware of the grenade she was detonating. "I don't know what we would have done if he hadn't helped us. I can't afford to miss work, and there's no way I could have paid for those repairs right now." Dad's customer service smile calcified into something hard and brittle as Emily continued praising my generosity. Jake darted around the garage, pointing at tools and asking rapid-fire questions nobody answered. Before they left, Jake pressed a folded paper into my hand, a crayon drawing of their truck with wings and flames. Across the top in wobbly letters, "Thank you, MR, FIXR. "Mom says you must be magic," Jake declared solemnly, "'cause she's smiling again. She didn't smile yesterday." Emily blushed, thanked me again, and guided Jake to their now smoothly running truck. I tucked the drawing into my wallet beside the faded photo of Gramps I'd kept since his funeral. Their departure left a silence, so thick it felt solid. "Office. Now." Dad's 2 words carried the weight of an avalanche. Uncle Roy was already waiting when we entered, somehow summoned by the invisible current of family crisis that seemed to flow through the walls of Hank's auto shop. "What the hell were you thinking?" Dad asked, voice unervingly quiet. "Using our shop, our equipment, our reputation to give away work." "I paid for all the parts myself," I countered, producing the receipt from my wallet, "and worked on my own time after hours." "That's not the point," Uncle Roy jumped in. "You undercut our business. Word gets around a town this size. Now everyone will expect charity." The argument spiraled from there, exposing fault lines that had been forming since Gramps first handed over the keys to his sons. This wasn't just about Emily's truck. It was about the fundamental difference in how we viewed the garage's purpose. To Dad and Roy, it was strictly business. To me, it was also about community and the legacy Gramps built. "Your grandfather nearly bankrupted us with his charity cases," Dad shouted, hitting where he knew it would hurt most. "I worked 60-hour weeks for years to keep this place afloat after he handed it over. And now you're pulling the same nonsense." I tried explaining Emily's situation, about Jake, about what would happen if she lost her job. Dad wasn't hearing it. "So your solution is to work for free? That's not how businesses survive, son." The fight lasted nearly an hour, drawing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Eventually, Dad delivered his ultimatum. "This stops now. No more freebies, no more discounts, no more charity. You work by our rules, or you don't work here at all." I thought of Emily's grateful eyes, of Jake's drawing, of Gramps saying a wrench becomes something sacred when used to help others. "I can't promise that," I said quietly. Dad stared at me for a long moment, hurt and anger warring on his face. Then he nodded once, sharply. "Then you're done here. Clean out your tools." The garage fell silent, except for the faint country music from the old radio. Uncle Roy looked away, unwilling to intervene. I saw regret in the slump of his shoulders, but not enough to stand against his brother. I gathered my things methodically. The tools I bought myself, the few personal items from my workstation, Gramps' old wrench set that Dad didn't dare claim as shop property. The other mechanics created a bubble of space around me, as if firing might be contagious. When I finished, Dad was waiting by the door. "You're not my son anymore," he said, each word precise and cutting. "Not until you come to your senses." I loaded my truck and drove away from the only workplace I'd ever known, the business that carried our family name, the concrete floor where I'd taken my first steps as a toddler. At least I had my own place, a small rental house on the edge of town I'd leased since turning 25. Nothing fancy, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, and a detached garage just big enough for my truck. The garage had been the selling point, a place to tinker away from Dad's watchful eye. I'd been paying Mrs. Hargrove rent for 6 years now, long enough that the place felt like mine. That night, I spread my bills across the kitchen table, calculating how long my savings would last. I'd never worked anywhere but Hank's auto shop. My entire identity had been Hank's kid, even after Gramps passed and the business transformed under Dad's leadership. The week that followed tested me like nothing before. I called every garage and mechanic shop within 30 miles. Most weren't hiring or were reluctant to touch someone who just had a falling out with Hank Wilson. In a small town, word travels faster than light. Easter Sunday arrived that weekend, nearly a week after my firing. Growing up, Easter had been sacred in our house. Not just religiously, as Gramps was a believer, but as an unbreakable family occasion. Mom, before cancer took her when I was 14, always made a ham with her special glaze, sweet potato casserole, and at least 3 kinds of pie. After she died, the tradition continued with aunts handling the cooking, but attendance remained non-negotiable. No matter what disagreements rippled through the family during the year, Easter dinner brought everyone together at Dad's dining room table. Even when I attempted community college 3 towns over, I drove back for Easter. This year, my phone stayed silent. No call from Dad, no text from Uncle Roy, not even a message from my cousins. I spent Easter Sunday alone in my little house, eating a frozen burger and chips from the corner gas station. Through the walls, I heard my neighbor families, kids laughing, parents calling them to settle down, people being together while I sat in isolation. The memories surfaced unbidden. Gramps leading the prayer before dinner, his weathered hands folded, thanking God not just for food, but for family bonds. Stronger than blood, he'd say, is the choice we make each day to love each other despite our flaws. The irony wasn't lost on me. I pulled out Gramps' old wrench, the one he'd given me on my 10th birthday. The metal was worn smooth from decades of use, first in his hands, then in mine. It was just a tool, but it represented everything I was fighting to preserve, that our work carried meaning beyond profit. Rain pattered against the windows as I remembered another of Gramps' sayings. Tommy, a man's character is like an old truck. You don't know what it's truly made of until it's been tested on rough roads. I was certainly on a rough road now, unemployed, disowned, and alone on the holiday that had always defined family for us. The Monday after Easter, I returned to the garage one final time, knowing Dad and Roy would be taking their traditional post-Easter day off. I'd left my expensive diagnostic scanner behind in the rush to leave, and needed it if I hoped to find work elsewhere. The garage was quiet, with only one of the newer mechanics, Steve, handling walk-ins. He gave me an awkward nod, but didn't say much. Nobody really knew what to say to the boss's son who'd just been disowned. As I collected my scanner, a familiar blue F-150 pulled into the lot. Emily got out, looking confused to see my truck parked at the side rather than in its usual spot. Her face fell when I explained what had happened. Because of us? Because you helped us. The distress in her voice made me regret my honesty. No! I lied. This was coming for a long time. Lots of reasons. She didn't believe me. I could see it in her eyes. But she let it drop. Jake and I don't have much, she said finally, but we have dinner together every night. You'd be welcome. Anytime. The invitation caught me off guard, warming something inside that had frozen during my lonely Easter. I thanked her but didn't commit. Getting more involved with Emily felt dangerous, like it would validate Dad's accusation that I'd chosen strangers over family. That afternoon, I organized my tools in my small garage, strategically arranging what I needed accessible versus what could be stored away. The reality was sinking in. At 31, I was starting over from scratch, cut off from everything familiar. At dusk, I stood in my driveway watching stars appear over the flat Texas horizon. The night air carried the scent of mesquite and distant rain. In my pocket, my fingers closed around Gramps' wrench. I won't give up, I whispered to the stars, to Gramps' memory, to myself. I thought about Emily and Jake, how a simple act of kindness had cost me almost everything but given them hope. Gramps used to say good deeds were like small nuts and bolts, tiny on their own, but capable of holding together things much larger than themselves. Maybe this bolt had broken free, causing the whole machine to come apart. Or maybe it was holding together something I couldn't yet see. Those stars became my compass that night, but the real journey was going to start with a garage. 2 weeks after Easter, I stood in my small garage looking at the tools I'd arranged on pegboards and shelves. My diagnostic equipment sat on a workbench I cobbled together from scrap lumber. The space was cramped, nothing like the sprawling bays at Hank's, but it was mine. No one to criticize my methods or question my decisions. The question was whether I could turn it into something that would put food on my table. I'd spent most of my savings on parts and supplies, transforming the garage from a storage space into a functional workshop. New lighting, better ventilation, a small office area in the corner with a desk for paperwork. My truck had to stay parked outside now, exposed to the elements, but that seemed like a fair trade. The day I hung my hand-painted sign, Wilson Auto Repair, above the garage door was both terrifying and exhilarating. I dropped the Hanks, but kept the Wilson name. It was mine too, after all. Even if Dad had tried to disown me, Gramps would have approved. Now, all I needed were customers. For the first few days, I sat in that garage waiting for business that never came. The silence was broken only by country radio and the occasional neighborhood dog barking. I flipped through old car magazines, organized my toolbox 3 different ways, and practiced diagnostic procedures I could do in my sleep. The isolation was the hardest part after years of working in a shop, bustling with mechanics and customers. By day 5, I was starting to wonder if I'd made a catastrophic mistake. Then the phone rang. It was Emily. My heart did a funny little skip when I heard her voice. "Just checking in," she said. "Jake keeps asking when we can visit your new garage. Says he wants to see where the wizard works." I was surprised she knew about my new setup. Then I remembered. The last time I saw her at Hank's, when I went back for my diagnostic scanner, I'd mentioned my plans to convert my home garage into a repair shop. She'd asked for my number then, saying she wanted to check how things were going. I laughed at the wizard comment. The first real laugh in weeks. Not much wizardry happening yet. I admitted, still waiting for my first customer. There was a pause on the line. Then, "You know what? I'm about to start my break at the diner. Mind if I swing by?" 30 minutes later, Emily arrived with 2 slices of Dot's famous apple pie wrapped in wax paper. We sat on folding chairs outside the garage, eating pie and watching clouds roll across the Texas sky. "The diner's been buzzing about what happened to Hank's," she said, picking at her pie. "People have opinions." My stomach tightened. In small towns, reputations can make or break you. What kind of opinions? You'd be surprised. A lot of folks remember how your grandfather ran things. They miss that. She glanced at me. "I might have mentioned your new place to a few regular customers. Hope that's okay." Before I could respond, a rusty Chevy pickup pulled into my driveway. The driver, an elderly man in overalls and a feed store cap, climbed out slowly. "You Tom Wilson?" he asked, squinting at me. "Betty down at the diner says you're Hank's boy, but you fix cars honest like your grandpa used to." And just like that, I had my first customer. Mr. Gunderson had an ignition problem that had stumped the chain auto store by the highway. I found and fixed it within an hour. When I told him the price, fair but not cheap, he didn't blink, just counted out the bills from a worn leather wallet and told me he'd be sending his buddies my way. He was true to his word. By the end of the week, I'd serviced 4 more vehicles, all older models owned by folks who remembered Gramps. They came with stories almost as rusty as their trucks, tales of how he'd saved a family vacation or kept a farm running through hard times. Word spread through the unique telegraph that exists in small towns, church pews, diner counters, school pickup lines. Emily, it turned out, was my most enthusiastic promoter. She'd mention my new shop to customers at Dot's, especially when they complained about prices at the chain stores or shoddy work from quick lube places. Soon I had a steady trickle of customers. Farmers with ancient tractors, teachers with sensible sedans. Even the local sheriff brought his personal truck when it started making a strange noise. They appreciated that I explained things in plain language, didn't upsell unnecessary services, and stood by my work. I wasn't getting rich, but I was surviving. The fear of total failure began to recede, replaced by a cautious optimism. Emily started stopping by regularly, sometimes with Jake in tow. The kid was fascinated by everything in the garage and asked a million questions that I tried to answer at his level. I showed him how to check tire pressure and change a wiper blade. Simple tasks that made him beam with pride. Sometimes Emily would bring dinner after her shift, nothing fancy, just diner leftovers, but it beat my usual bachelor fare of sandwiches and microwave frozen meals. We'd sit outside on those warm spring evenings, talking while Jake explored the yard or drew elaborate car designs on scrap paper. I learned more about her during those casual meals than I had in all the time before. How she'd had Jake young, barely 20. How his father had stuck around just long enough to see the positive pregnancy test before disappearing to Alaska or Wyoming. She wasn't sure which. How she'd worked 2 jobs while finishing her high school diploma through night classes. Her strength amazed me. While I was wallowing in self-pity over being kicked out of family business, she'd been raising a kid alone, keeping them both fed and housed, never missing a day of work unless Jake was sick. No family support, no safety net, just pure determination and grit. "You make it sound heroic," she said once when I told her how impressed I was. "It's not. It's just what you do when there's no other choice. You keep going." There was something about her matter-of-fact courage that made my own problems seem smaller, and something about her smile that made my days brighter. I was halfway to falling for her before I even realized it was happening. About a month after opening my shop, Emily arrived with an older man I hadn't met before. Tall and lean, with the same direct gaze as Emily, but hair gone silver and hands that showed years of hard work. "This is my dad, Charles," she said. "Dad, this is Tom." Charles's handshake was firm, his assessment of me obvious as he took in my appearance and the small garage behind me. "Emily tells me you're a decent mechanic," he said, voice gruff but not unfriendly. "Says you fixed her truck when nobody else would help." I shrugged, suddenly feeling like a teenager being sized up before prom date, though Emily and I weren't even officially dating. Charles didn't talk much at first, just wandered around my garage, examining tools and looking under the hood of the Buick I was working on. His hands moved with the practiced confidence of someone who knew engines intimately. "Ford man?" I asked, noticing the vintage Ford cap he wore. That opened the floodgates. Charles had spent 30 years as an engineer at Ford before taking early retirement. He spoke the language of engines with a fluency that reminded me of Gramps. Before long, we were deep in conversation about camshafts and fuel injection systems, while Emily rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "I knew you two would either hate each other or never stop talking," she said. "Looks like it's option 2. Over the next few weeks, Charles started dropping by regularly, sometimes with Emily, sometimes alone. He'd bring coffee and sit in the garage watching me work, offering occasional suggestions or telling stories about his days at Ford. One evening, after a particularly frustrating day trying to diagnose an electrical problem in a temperamental Cadillac, Charles cleared his throat. "Been meaning to show you something," he said, pulling a rolled-up set of blueprints from his truck. "Project I worked on before retirement. Never got past the prototype stage." He spread the drawings across my workbench, detailed schematics for a hybrid engine system designed for trucks and larger vehicles. It was elegant in its complexity, combining traditional combustion power with electric assistance in a way I hadn't seen before. "Company killed it," Charles explained, tracing lines on the blueprint with a weathered finger. "Too expensive to develop," they said. "Not enough market demand." This was back in '02, when gas was cheap and nobody cared about emissions. Always thought they were short-sighted. I studied the designs, fascinated. The system was ambitious. A V8 that could deliver the power truck owners demanded, while significantly reducing fuel consumption and emissions. There were some clever innovations I recognized, and others I didn't fully understand. "This is incredible work," I said honestly. "Why are you showing me?" Charles shrugged, suddenly seeming almost shy. "Emily says you're not just a fix-it man. Says you understand how things could be better, not just how they are." That night after Charles left, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those blueprints, about possibilities. Gramps used to say, "Tommy, never be scared of old rusty ideas. That's just where the future is hiding until somebody polishes it up." The next morning, I called Charles. "Your hybrid design, could we build it?" Not production ready, just a working prototype, simplified, using available parts. There was a long pause on the line. Been asking myself that question for years, he finally answered. Never had the right combination of time, space, and helping hands. You offering? Yeah, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I am. That's how my small garage became an unofficial skunkworks operation. Charles brought his expertise and industry connections. I contributed practical mechanical knowledge and a space to work. We started with his original designs, then began adapting them to use more readily available components. The goal was to create something that could be retrofitted to existing vehicles rather than requiring entirely new manufacturing. We worked evenings and weekends, often late into the night. Emily would bring us food, shake her head at our grease-stained clothes and bleary eyes, but I caught the pride in her expression when she looked at her father. At 72, Charles had a new spark in him that apparently had been missing for years. I haven't seen him this excited since before Mom passed, she told me once while we watched him tinker with a fuel delivery system. You gave him his purpose back. The project was challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. Theoretical engineering and practical mechanical work required different mindsets. Charles and I argued frequently, each convinced our approach was better. Sometimes we'd hit dead ends that sent us back to square one after weeks of work. Tom, you're either a genius or a fool with a wrench, Charles grumbled one night after a particularly heated debate about battery placement. I laughed. Maybe both. Gramps used to say the line between those two is thinner than most people think. Despite the frustrations, there was something deeply satisfying about the work. It wasn't just fixing what was broken. It was building something that hadn't existed before. As spring turned to summer, our prototype gradually took shape. We'd modified a standard Ford 5.8 engine with a hybrid electric system, creating something that, in theory, would deliver the power truck owners wanted while using significantly less fuel and producing fewer emissions. In practice, it was temperamental as hell. Some days it would run beautifully. Others, it would refuse to start or shut down unexpectedly. Charles took each setback personally, while I tried to maintain perspective. Gramps said the best inventions are built on a mountain of failures. I told him during a particularly discouraging evening. He also said not to be afraid of dirt. The best things are born in dust. Your grandfather sounds like he was either very wise or just good at making excuses for setbacks, Charles replied, but he was smiling as he said it. Meanwhile, my repair business continued to grow. I was getting enough steady work to pay my bills, with a little left over to invest in the hybrid project. I'd built a loyal customer base who appreciated honest work at fair prices. Some were people who'd been coming to Hank's for years and followed me when they heard the story of why I'd left. I never badmouthed Dad or Uncle Roy, no matter how curious customers got. Just said we had different ideas about running a business and left it at that. Small towns have long memories, and burning bridges rarely ends well. I hadn't spoken to either of them since Easter. Sometimes I'd see Dad's truck passing on Main Street and feel a pang of something between sadness and anger. Gramps would be disappointed in both of us for letting things go this way. Emily and I were dancing around whatever was growing between us. We spent multiple evenings a week together, often with Jake or Charles around, but sometimes just the two of us. We'd talk about everything and nothing. Her hopes of someday going to nursing school, my childhood memories of working alongside Gramps, books we'd read, places we'd like to visit. There were moments when the conversation would lull, and we'd catch each other's eyes for a beat too long. Moments when her hand would brush mine while passing a tool or a plate, and neither of us would pull away quite as quickly as we should. But neither of us made a move to change the definition of what we were to each other. Maybe we were both too scarred by past hurts. Maybe the timing wasn't right. Or maybe we were both afraid of risking the friendship we'd built. Late one August night, Charles and I were making final adjustments to our hybrid prototype, preparing for our first real test drive the next day. We'd mounted the engine in an old Ford F-150 that Charles had bought cheap at an auction, a perfect test bed for our creation. What if it doesn't work? I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing as our test approached. What if after all this time and money it just fails? Charles tightened the bolt with methodical precision before answering. Then we learn from it and try again. He said simply, "That's engineering. That's life." I nodded, thinking how much he sounded like Gramps in that moment. The next day dawned clear and hot, a typical Texas summer morning. Emily and Jake came to witness our first test, Jake bouncing with excitement and Emily trying to temper his expectations while shooting worried glances at her father and me. The moment of truth came after a final systems check. Charles slid behind the wheel while I stood watching, heart pounding. He turned the key and the engine coughed, sputtered, and caught. The familiar rumble of the V8 was there, but softer, accompanied by the faint whine of the electric system. Charles's face split into a wide grin as he revved the engine experimentally. It wasn't perfect. I could hear some timing issues we'd need to address, but it was running. Our hybrid was alive. We took turns driving it around the neighborhood, testing acceleration and monitoring the systems. The truck moved with surprising power, the electric motors providing instant torque that complemented the V8 strength. Fuel consumption readings showed a nearly 40% improvement over the standard engine. When we returned to my garage, Charles shut off the engine and sat in silence for a moment. "We did it," he said finally, his voice thick. "It's rough, but the fundamentals are solid." Emily hugged us both. Jake danced around the truck asking if he could drive it next. The answer was a firm no. And for a moment, everything felt possible. Then reality set in. Our prototype worked, but it was just that, a prototype. Rough, unrefined, and a long way from anything that could be commercially viable. We had no connections to manufacturers, no financial backing, no clear path forward. That evening, Emily found me sitting alone on my front steps, staring at the stars. "Why the long face?" she asked, settling beside me. "You guys did something amazing today." Did we? Or did we just build an interesting science project that nobody will ever see? She bumped my shoulder with hers. "Since when is Tom Wilson a pessimist? What happened to a guy who started his own business with nothing but tools and determination?" I sighed. "That guy hasn't been getting much sleep lately. Makes him cranky." She laughed, then grew serious. "You've already changed my life, Tom. Now, maybe you'll change the world, too." I looked at her in the dim porch light, suddenly acutely aware of how close she was sitting, how the evening breeze carried the scent of her shampoo, how much I'd come to depend on her presence in my life. Something shifted between us in that moment, a boundary dissolving, a decision made without words. When I leaned in to kiss her, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. And when she kissed me back, it felt like coming home. But even as something beautiful was beginning, the challenges ahead loomed large. Our prototype was fragile, not ready for the scrutiny of industry experts. My business was stable but hardly flourishing, and I still carried the weight of my broken relationship with Dad. Fall arrived in Texas with little relief from the summer heat, but brought a new energy to our hybrid engine project. After the initial test drive success, Charles, Emily, and I spent every available minute refining our prototype. We worked through countless problems, overheating issues, battery management glitches, integration challenges with the standard transmission. Each solution brought us closer to something truly viable. Emily became what Charles affectionately called our common sense manager. While Charles and I could get lost in technical details for days, Emily kept us grounded with practical questions. Will this be affordable? Can an average mechanic install it? Will truck owners actually want it? You, too, would build a rocket to Mars if nobody stopped you, she told us one evening while bringing dinner to the garage. Meanwhile, I'm just trying to make sure this thing can survive a Texas pothole. Her perspective was invaluable. Charles and I were engineers at heart, him formally trained, me self-taught through years of practical experience. Emily represented our eventual customers. Practical people who cared about reliability, cost, and real-world performance, not just impressive specs on paper. By October, we had something special, a hybrid system that delivered V8 power with significantly better fuel economy and reduced emissions, all in a package that could be retrofitted to existing trucks and larger vehicles. The system wasn't perfect, but it worked consistently now, and the improvements were undeniable. What's next? Emily asked one evening as we celebrated another successful test run. Charles and I exchanged glances. We'd been so focused on making the thing work that we hadn't really discussed what to do once we succeeded. We could try to sell the design to a major manufacturer, Charles suggested. I still have some contacts at Ford who might be interested. Or we could license the technology. I offered, let multiple companies use it for a fee. Emily shook her head. You're thinking too small. This thing could be huge if presented right. 2 days later, she slapped a printout on my workbench. It was information about the North American International Auto Show in Detroit, one of the biggest automotive events in the country, where manufacturers and suppliers showcase their latest innovations. The application deadline for the innovation showcase is next week, she said. Charles, don't you still know someone on the selection committee? Charles looked surprised. Jim Donovan? We worked together for years. But Emily, that's a big stage. The major players spend millions on their presentations. So, you have something better than a fancy booth. You have an innovation that actually works. That night, Charles made a call to his old colleague. I could tell from his side of the conversation that Jim was skeptical at first, but grew increasingly interested as Charles described our hybrid system. When he hung up, there was a new light in his eyes. Jim's arranging for us to get a special entry slot, Small Innovators category. We'll need to submit technical documentation and a video demonstration within the week. Emily immediately took charge of our presentation materials, while Charles and I compiled the technical specs. For the next several days, I barely slept. This was our shot, a chance to show the automotive world what 3 determined people from a small Texas town had created. The weeks before the auto show passed in a blur of preparations, we refinished the exterior of our test truck, a 1998 Ford F-150 that Charles had bought at auction, giving a professional-looking metallic blue paint job. I rebuilt and detailed the engine bay until it gleamed. Emily coordinated everything from our display materials to our hotel reservations in Detroit. The financial strain was significant. Between parts for the final prototype refinements, the truck restoration, and travel expenses, I had to take out a loan against my house. Charles contributed his retirement savings. Emily picked up extra shifts at the diner. We're all in, I told them one night as we finalized our presentation. No turning back now. January in Detroit was a harsh adjustment after Texas. The bitter cold hit us like a physical blow as we stepped off the plane, making me glad I'd listened to Emily and bought a proper winter coat. Our test truck had been shipped ahead and was waiting for us at the convention center, the heart of our presentation and the culmination of months of work. The night before the show, I barely slept. The enormity of what we were attempting finally hit me. We were nobodies from nowhere, about to compete for attention with automotive giants. What if nobody cared about our innovation? What if they laughed us out of the building? I must have looked as anxious as I felt the next morning, because Emily squeezed my hand as we entered the massive exhibition hall. You're my hero, Tom Wilson, she said quietly, with grease stains or without. Our display was modest compared to the million-dollar presentations from major manufacturers, but we had the advantage of being in the innovation showcase area, where attendees specifically came looking for new ideas. Charles had insisted on a transparent engine cover, so people could see our hybrid system in operation. We had detailed diagrams explaining the technology and performance data showing the improvements in fuel economy and emissions. The first day started slowly. People wandered by, glanced at our display, and mostly kept moving toward the flashier exhibits. But then something unexpected happened. A well-known automotive YouTuber stopped to talk with Charles, intrigued by our retrofit approach. He filmed a short segment with us, asking detailed technical questions that Charles answered with the confidence of a lifelong engineer. By afternoon, that video was trending in automotive circles. Suddenly, our little booth was drawing crowds. It's the perfect solution for rural America, I heard myself explaining to a group of interested industry professionals. Delivers the power farmers and contractors need, with fuel savings that make a real difference to their bottom line. Charles handled the technical questions with the expertise of his 30 years at Ford. Emily charmed everyone with her straightforward explanations of how the system would benefit ordinary drivers. It roars like a Mustang but saves your wallet like a Prius, became her catchphrase, drawing laughs and nods of understanding. What really sold people, though, was seeing it in action. We were permitted short demonstration drives in a designated area outside the convention center. The immediate torque from the electric motors, combined with the familiar power of the V8, impressed even the most skeptical industry veterans. On the second day, a man in an expensive suit approached our booth. He introduced himself as Michael Reeves, representing a venture capital firm that specialized in automotive technology. "I've been watching you folks," he said, handing me his card. "You've created something special here. My partners and I would like to discuss investment opportunities." He wasn't the only one. By the end of the show, we had collected business cards from 3 investment groups, 2 major parts manufacturers, and a representative from the Department of Energy interested in green technology initiatives. The most surprising visitor came on the final day, a senior engineering executive from Ford, who spent over an hour examining our system and asking pointed questions. He was particularly interested in our approach to heat management, which had been one of our biggest challenges. "Charles, you always were ahead of your time," he said finally, shaking his former colleague's hand. "The company should have listened to you years ago." Back at our hotel room that night, we spread the business cards across the bed, barely able to believe the response we'd received. The automotive world was interested, not just in our technology, but in us. People wanted to meet, to discuss, to explore possibilities. "What do we do now?" I asked, feeling both exhilarated and overwhelmed. Charles looked thoughtful. "We need to be careful. Some of these folks will want to buy the technology outright and bury it if it threatens their existing products." Emily, practical as always, was already making lists. "First, we need a lawyer. Then we need to figure out exactly what we want." What followed was a whirlwind of meetings, negotiations, and decisions. We returned to Texas, but were constantly on conference calls or flying to meetings with potential partners. After considering multiple options, we decided to partner with Reeves Venture Capital Firm, which offered the best combination of financial support and creative control. They provided the funds to establish Wilson Parker Automotive Technologies, named for Charles and me, with headquarters in Austin. We develop and manufacture hybrid conversion kits for existing vehicles, focusing initially on trucks and SUVs. The business model was perfect. We provide an eco-friendly option for vehicles already on the road, rather than waiting for fleet turnover. Charles became our technical director. I headed up practical implementation and quality control, and Emily, after finally quitting her waitressing job, managed operations. Our first manufacturing facility was modest, employing 20 people to start, but we had ambitious expansion plans. Spring brought our first production run. Conversion kits for Ford F-150s manufactured between 1995 and 2005. The initial feedback was overwhelming. Customers loved the improved performance and fuel savings. Mechanics appreciated the thoughtful design that made installation straightforward. Environmental groups praised our approach to reducing emissions from existing vehicles. Orders poured in, beyond our most optimistic projections. We quickly scaled up production, moving to a larger facility and hiring more staff. By summer, we had expanded our product line to include kits for Chevrolet and Dodge trucks, with SUV applications in development. The financial rewards were substantial. For the first time in my life, I wasn't worrying about money. The loan on my house was paid off. I bought a new truck, fitted with our system, of course. But more meaningful than the money was seeing our creation making a difference. Every converted vehicle meant less pollution and more savings for its owner. With success came media attention. Local news covered us first, then regional business publications, and finally national outlets. Popular Mechanics ran a feature on our technology. Car and driver tested our system against conventional engines and came away impressed. A segment on CNN highlighted us as an example of American innovation addressing environmental challenges. I found myself uncomfortably thrust into the spotlight as the face of our company. Charles preferred to stay behind the scenes, and Emily was too busy keeping everything running smoothly to handle press duties. So it fell to me to give interviews, demonstrate the technology, and tell our story. Just be yourself, Emily advised before my first television appearance. That's who people believe in. Our personal relationship had flourished alongside our business success. Emily and I had been dating officially since that kiss outside my garage, but our busy schedules made quality time together challenging. Still, we managed to carve out moments. Dinner dates after long work days, weekend mornings with Jake making pancakes, occasional day trips to nearby state parks when we could get away. Jake had become my buddy, asking endless questions about cars and engines. I taught him basic maintenance skills, and he soaked up knowledge like a sponge. When he brought home an A on his science project about hybrid engines, his proud grin felt like my own personal achievement. One evening in late September, I took Emily to a spot outside town where the Texas hills offered a perfect view of the sunset. The timing felt right. We'd known each other for over a year, grown close through challenges and triumphs, built something meaningful together. The sky was painted in brilliant oranges and purples. As I pulled the small velvet box from my pocket, I'd rehearsed an elaborate speech, but in the moment, simplicity felt right. "Emily, you make everything in my life better. Will you marry me?" The tears in her eyes reflected the sunset as she nodded, then laughed, then pulled me into a kiss that answered more eloquently than words. Jake was thrilled when we told him, immediately asking if he could be my best kid at the wedding. Charles pretended to be surprised, but later admitted he'd been expecting this announcement for months. We set the date for April, almost exactly a year after I'd fixed Emily's truck and set this whole journey in motion. Nothing fancy, just a small ceremony at the local church where Emily had grown up, followed by a reception at her father's place. The wedding was everything we wanted, simple, heartfelt, surrounded by friends who'd supported us through the ups and downs of the past year. Jake carried our rings down the aisle with solemn importance, breaking into a huge grin when he successfully completed his mission. Emily was radiant in a simple white dress, her happiness more beautiful than any elaborate gown could have made her. Gramps would have loved it all. As I said my vows, I felt his presence somehow, that same warmth I'd felt when he taught me about engines and life and doing the right thing. The gold wedding band slipping onto my finger felt like completing a circuit, connecting past, present, and future. After the ceremony, Jake tugged me down to his level to whisper an important question. "Does this mean I can call you Dad now?" My heart nearly burst. "If you want to, buddy, I'd be honored." Our honeymoon was brief, just a long weekend in hill country, because the business demanded our attention, but we didn't mind. We were building something together, literally and figuratively. Throughout that year, our company continued to grow. We expanded our product line, opened a second manufacturing facility, and began developing next-generation systems with even better performance. Charles filed multiple patents, securing our technological edge. Emily's operational expertise kept everything running smoothly despite our rapid growth. We maintained our founding principles: quality products, fair prices, and ethical business practices. I insisted that we offered discounted systems to public services like fire departments and schools. We established a foundation that provided free vehicle repairs to struggling families, something Gramps would have approved of wholeheartedly. My personal garage became a testing ground for new ideas, much as it had been when we first developed our hybrid system. I'd often spend evenings there, tinkering with concepts that might become future products. Sometimes Jake would join me, learning about tools and engines while sharing the details of his school day. Our life settled into a happy rhythm, challenging workdays followed by peaceful evenings as a family. Emily and I bought a larger house with room for all of us, including a proper workshop for my projects and a study for Charles when he visited. It wasn't extravagant, but it was comfortable and filled with laughter. I sometimes thought about Dad and Uncle Roy, wondering how they were doing. I'd seen Dad around town occasionally, but we hadn't spoken. Pride on both sides kept the silence intact, though sometimes I considered reaching out. Gramps would have wanted us to reconcile. Then one rainy Tuesday in November, nearly 2 years after I'd left Hank's auto shop, I returned to my office after manufacturing floor inspection to find Emily waiting with an unusual expression. "Your Uncle Roy called," she said carefully. "He wants to meet with you." My stomach tightened. Did he say why? Not exactly. Just that it was important. Something about Hank's shop. I sat heavily in my chair, memories flooding back. The garage where I'd grown up, the family legacy, the painful split. Hank's auto shop is struggling, Emily added softly. There are rumors they might have to close. The news hit me harder than expected. Despite everything, I couldn't imagine our town without Hank's. It had been a fixture for decades, first under Gramps and then Dad. The thought of it disappearing felt wrong, like losing a piece of local history, my history. I agreed to meet Roy at a diner, halfway between our businesses. Emily offered to come along for support, but this felt like something I needed to handle alone. Roy looked older than I remembered. Worry lines etched deeper around his eyes. We exchanged awkward greetings, then sat in uncomfortable silence until the waitress brought coffee. "Shop's in trouble," he finally said, staring into his cup. "Been losing customers steady since you left. That chain place by the highway's killing us on price, and—" He hesitated. "Folks miss your grandfather's way of doing things." I waited, sensing there was more. Roy shifted uncomfortably. "Your dad won't admit it, but we need help. Financially, sure, but also—" He looked up at me directly. "We need you back, Tom. Your knowledge, your way with customers. The Wilson touch." The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been fired for the very qualities they now wanted back. My grandfather's approach to business, treating people like people rather than walking wallets. Where's Dad in all this? I asked. Roy sighed. Stubborn as ever. Doesn't know I'm here. But he's hurting, Tom. The shop's his life, and watching it fail is killing him. I sat back, conflicted emotions swirling. Part of me felt vindicated. They were finally admitting I'd been right. Another part remembered Gramps saying, "Holding grudges is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." "I'll think about it," I promised Roy, not ready to commit either way. That night, I told Emily and Charles about the meeting. Their responses were predictably different. They threw you out when you needed them. Charles reminded me, "You don't owe them anything." Emily was more measured. "What do you want to do, Tom? Not what should you do. What do you want?" I didn't have an immediate answer. Our company was thriving. I had a new family, success beyond what I'd imagined. Did I really want to get pulled back into the past? But as I lay awake that night, I thought about Gramps and his legacy, about second chances and doing the right thing even when it's hard, about family in all its complicated glory. Success tasted sweet, but the past was waiting just around the corner. After a sleepless night thinking about Uncle Roy's request, I drove past Hank's auto shop before heading to work. I didn't stop, just slowed down enough to take it in. The place looked tired. Faded paint, fewer cars in the lot than there should have been on a weekday morning, and a general air decline that was impossible to miss. This was a garage where I'd taken my first steps, where Gramps had placed a wrench in my small hands and changed the course of my life. The concrete floors held decades of Wilson family history in their oil stains. I couldn't just let it disappear. After discussing it with Emily and Charles, I arranged to meet Dad at the shop after hours. When I pulled up, his truck was the only vehicle in the lot. The neon in the Hank's auto shop sign flickered erratically, with a K completely dark, a fitting symbol for the business's current state. The familiar smell hit me as I walked in. Oil, rubber, metal, and that indefinable garage scent that had been the backdrop to my childhood. Dad was at his desk in the office, looking smaller than I remembered. His hair had more gray, and his shoulders slumped with a weariness I'd never seen in him before. He stood when he saw me, his expression a complicated mix of pride, shame, and stubborn defiance. For a moment, neither of us spoke. 2 years of silence stretched between us like a wall. Dad broke it first, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. I sat, noting the stack of past due notices and bank statements on the desk. The situation was clearly worse than Roy had indicated. Dad didn't waste time with small talk. He explained how the business had been struggling since even before I left. The big chain shops were undercutting their prices, and younger customers were choosing the places with fancy waiting rooms and free Wi-Fi. Then when I left, they lost my regular customers too. Turns out, he admitted grudgingly, people like your way of doing things. We discussed numbers, logistics, the hard reality of their financial situation. Dad had mortgaged his house to keep the shop afloat. They let 2 mechanics go and were still barely making payroll for remaining staff. Another 6 months like this, and Hank's auto shop will be nothing but a memory. It was only after we covered all the practical details that Dad finally addressed the elephant in the room. "I was wrong, Tom," he said, the words clearly difficult for him. "About Emily's truck. About a lot of things." Coming from Dad, this was the equivalent of a dramatic public apology. He'd never been a man to admit mistakes easily. I thought about the hurt I'd carried since that Easter, when my family had shut me out, about the anger that had fueled me through those early difficult days of starting my own business, about Gramps saying that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting wrongs, but about not letting them control your future. Gramps used to say that sometimes you have to tear down an engine completely before you can rebuild it better. I told Dad, maybe that's what needed to happen with us. He nodded, understanding the reference in a way only another mechanic would. "Your grandfather was right about a lot of things," he admitted. "I was too stubborn to see it until it was almost too late." We talked longer that evening than we had in years, maybe ever, about the shop, about Gramps, about the changes in both our lives. I told him about our hybrid technology, and though he scoffed at first, he became increasingly interested as I explained mechanics. Dad had never been anti-innovation, just cautious about change that hadn't proven itself. By the time we finished, the outline of a plan had formed. I would help save Hank's auto shop, but not simply with cash infusion. The business needed comprehensive restructuring to survive in today's market. As I stood to leave, Dad hesitated, then reached out his hand. When I took it, he pulled me into an awkward but genuine hug. "Proud of you, son," he said gruffly. "Always have been, even when I was too bullheaded to show it." Over the next few weeks, we hammered out the details of the partnership between Wilson Parker Automotive Technologies and Hank's Auto Shop. The garage would become our first authorized installation center for hybrid conversion kits, with Dad and Roy's mechanics receiving specialized training. We'd renovate the facilities, update the equipment, and bring the business into the modern era without losing its neighborhood character. Emily was instrumental in designing the new business model. She suggested creating a comfortable waiting area where customers could watch their vehicles being worked on through a large window, combining the transparency of Gramps' approach with the customer experience modern consumers expected. One of my favorite additions was her idea for a wall of history, displaying photos of Gramps, the original opening of the shop, and memorable moments through the decades. It honored our past while looking toward the future. The most contentious point came when I insisted on implementing Gramps' philosophy of community service. Each month, the shop will provide free or discounted repairs for families in need, funded partly by our foundation and partly by the shop's profits. Dad resisted initially, arguing that this had been what nearly bankrupted them before. But I showed him the numbers from my own business, how goodwill translated to customer loyalty, free word-of-mouth advertising, and ultimately to sustainable growth. "It's not charity for charity's sake," I explained. "It's smart business with a heart." Gramps understood that instinctively. Eventually, Dad conceded, though he insisted on a structured program rather than the ad hoc approach Gramps had used. That was fair. Even good intentions needed proper management. The renovation took 2 months. We closed the shop for 3 weeks during the most intensive work, keeping mechanics on payroll to help with the renovation and begin their hybrid system training. The result was remarkable, a business that honored its roots while embracing the future. The grand reopening was a community event. We had a barbecue in the parking lot, demonstrations of the hybrid technology, and special first-month discounts. Emily managed the event with her usual efficiency, while Jake proudly gave tours to anyone who would follow him, pointing out features with the authority of a miniature manager. The turnout exceeded our expectations. Former customers returned, curious about the changes. New faces appeared, drawn by the publicity around our hybrid systems. Even some of Dad's most stubborn old-timer friends showed up, ostensibly to see what all the fuss was about, but really to support the revival of a local institution. The most meaningful moment came when Jake discovered the display case I'd added without telling anyone. Inside was Gramps' original toolbox, The one he'd used to open the shop back in '85, along with his worn cap and a handwritten business plan he'd scrawled on the back of a parts invoice. Beside it sat the wrench he'd given me on my 10th birthday, my most treasured possession. "Why is your special wrench in there?" Jake asked, peering through glass. "Because this place is where it all started." I told him, "Where I learned that fixing things means more than just making them work again. It means making them better." Jake considered this with a seriousness only an 8-year-old can muster, then nodded as if I confirmed something he already knew. The months that followed brought steady improvement to Hank's finances. The hybrid installation provided a new revenue stream that competitors couldn't match. Dad and Roy gradually embraced the changes, especially as they saw the results in both the books and in customer satisfaction. Our foundation, officially named the Henry Gramps Wilson Community Support Fund, expanded its work beyond vehicle repairs. We established a scholarship for local kids interested in automotive technology or engineering, sponsored a youth program teaching basic car maintenance, and partnered with a community college to offer specialized training. At Emily's suggestion, we particularly focus on supporting single parents and their children, providing reliable transportation, maintenance education, and even employment opportunities where possible. Every time we helped a family like hers had once been, I felt Gramps' principles coming full circle. One sunny spring afternoon about a year after the renovation, I found myself alone in the shop after closing. Dad and Roy had gone home, and the mechanics had left for the day. The quiet was peaceful, just the occasional tick of cooling metal and the distant sounds of traffic outside. I walked through the bays, running my hand along the now modern equipment. The shop had the same soul but a new heart, like an old truck with our hybrid system installed. Not replaced, just improved. Near the entrance, I paused at the wall of photos. Emily had continued to add to it, creating a visual timeline of the Wilson family's automotive legacy. The newest addition was a picture from last month. Dad, Roy, me, Charles, Emily, and Jake, all standing in front of a truck fitted with our 10,000 hybrid system. 4 generations of Wilson automotive passion, connected by more than just DNA. My reflection in the glass mingled with Gramps' image from decades earlier. There was a resemblance I hadn't noticed before, not just physical traits, but something in the expression, the stance, the way we both looked at the world as a series of problems that could be solved with the right tools and enough persistence. "You were right, Gramps," I said quietly to the photograph, "about pretty much everything." I could almost hear his reply, the same thing he'd tell me when I'd successfully diagnosed a particularly tricky engine problem. "Didn't doubt you for a minute, Tommy boy." As I locked up, the newly restored sign caught the evening light. Hank's Auto Shop, glowing steadily above, authorized Wilson Parker Hybrid Center in slightly smaller letters. The perfect blend of past and future. Emily and Jake were waiting in the truck, ready for our weekly Sunday dinner with Dad, Roy, and Charles. These gatherings had become a tradition, sometimes tense but mostly healing, as our reconstructed family learned to work together again. Looking at them, my wife brushing Jake's hair out of his eyes while he excitedly recounted something from school, I felt a completeness I hadn't known was possible. The anger that had driven me after being fired had transformed into something constructive, something that honored Gramps' legacy while creating my own. Success, I discovered, wasn't measured in dollars or fame, though we'd found both. It was measured in the lives we touched, the problems we solved, and the love we built along the way. Just like a good engine, reliable and true. I slid behind the wheel, Jake immediately launching into questions about a car he'd seen at school. Emily squeezed my hand knowingly as I started the engine, its hybrid system humming with quiet efficiency beneath the familiar V8 rumble. "Ready to go home?" she asked. I was, in every sense of the word.